So, I'm going to be starting a new series on this show talking about ballot initiatives. I've noticed it's something that election Twitter is not talking about as much, and I feel like it would be a really great niche to fill to let everyone know what exactly Americans are going to be voting on this November. This first part is going to talk about ballot initiatives that are being voted on that deal with drugs, particularly marijuana, but not just marijuana, also magic mushrooms, as we're going to find out later in this episode. So, Joe, do you want to give a brief overview on the history of ballot initiatives concerning marijuana, or should I do that?
Well, yeah, it all started with Colorado a number of years back, and they decided to go for a legalization of marijuana, not just the sneaky way in with the medical marijuana. They went full on, we're going to legalize marijuana, and I believe Washington State quickly followed in after them. And apparently it's been somewhat successful. It's brought in a lot of revenue for Colorado, and other states have started to follow through. I guess Colorado hasn't seen, the problems that they were saying that, more kids were going to use it. They've done some studies, and they said kids aren't using it any more than they used to. I know when I was in high school, it was barely around all the time anyway, so I don't see how making it legal was going to make it any different for the kids. And then that expanded to California, of course, Massachusetts, Maine, I think recently had one, and now we have 5 more states who are trying to legalize marijuana. The biggest one basically being New Jersey and Arizona. And, this is following through, and it seems that Obama made a decision that he wasn't going to prosecute or use federal laws to prosecute anybody. It's still kind of stuck in the weeds, though, with the banking regulations and the federal rules regarding securities. And the marijuana growers and dealers have a lot of problems with that. But so far, when Jeff Sessions came in, he said he was going to crack down on it. But I think, money rules in America. And if you're making money off marijuana in these states, people are going to back off a little bit. And Jeff Sessions never really followed through with his cracking down on these states and the marijuana laws. So now it seems to be it's expanding further. We got big states like Arizona, and relatively big state like New Jersey, trying to legalize marijuana the same as these other states did. And I see no stopping it, really. The only problem is with the only places where it's stopped there are individual states like my home state of South Carolina where ballot initiatives are not allowed. So you can only have the legislature vote on it. The legislature can post a ballot initiative if they so wish, but they don't so wish. So in those states, you're not going to get these initiatives regarding medical marijuana. Now, Oregon and Washington are states that have legalized marijuana, and Oregon has now just come out with a new ballot initiative to legalize psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, as more informally known, but only under therapy or therapeutic means. I know, Jonathan, you and I can see who's a therapist now. All the magic mushroom therapists popping up in Oregon State saying, "Hey, I want to be a therapist, and let's deal some magic mushrooms." So I don't know what your thoughts on it are.
Yeah, so I just want to sort of add to the history that you've pointed out. In the 1990s, a number of states started actually legalizing medical marijuana. And at the time, the federal government actually interfered in those states because officially under federal law, marijuana is still completely illegal. And so you had these challenges, in administering medical marijuana programs. And eventually in 2005, the Supreme Court essentially ruled that the Commerce Clause does allow the federal government to ban the sale and use of marijuana. And it's actually an interesting, because 3 of the justices who are on the more conservative wing of the court, William Rehnquist, Sandra Day O'Connor, and Clarence Thomas, they were actually of the opinion that no, the Commerce Clause doesn't allow that. Whereas it was the more liberal justices that said, yeah, the federal government can do that. And so I actually found that fascinating that there was an ideological divergence, that's not typical of what you see in politics. Often I see Republicans are opposed to marijuana, Democrats support it. So it was interesting to see that split. So, but in terms of states that have legalized the substance, 11 states have done so. I believe Colorado and Washington were the first. Then Oregon, Alaska, Washington, D.C. were a couple of years later. Then California, Nevada, Massachusetts, and Maine legalized it in 2016, at the same time that Donald Trump was getting elected. Then Vermont and Illinois were followed in from 2008 to 2019, as well as Michigan, which I think had one of the most strict marijuana laws in the country, but they too voted to legalize the substance. Now, let's talk very briefly about medicinal marijuana that's being voted on this year, because Nebraska and South Dakota, I believe, are both voting, and Mississippi are both voting on medicinal marijuana programs. And it's worth noting that because I think that Nebraska and South Dakota are two of the three remaining states that don't have any medicinal marijuana program at all. And if they're both successful, only Idaho will have no medicinal marijuana program at all, because the ballot initiative did not qualify there. And
well, we don't have in South Carolina medical marijuana either.
Right, and interesting. So I'll have to check the data on that. I thought for some reason that they might have had something, but I trust you on that.
Well, the thing about the medical marijuana that I find curious is it, of course, pundits and commentators can see, yeah, it's the thin end of the wedge. You start to get the medical marijuana in that you smack that wedge in, and once you open it up for medical marijuana, then a few years later, a half dozen years later, you can legalize marijuana. And I think part of it is the medical marijuana. You have a lot of veterans who say it helps them with their PTSD. It helps them with some of their issues regarding pain, that they've received overseas. So that makes a lot of conservatives pause and think, well, if veterans are talking about medical marijuana, if veterans are talking about how it helps them and helps ease their pain and suffering, I want to be on that side. So that's why you get a lot of these conservative states like Mississippi, like you said, and either North or South Dakota, that start to realize that they can help veterans with these problems. So you get the sneaky end, the thin end of the wedge in there, and with the veterans issues and the PTSD, and people are sympathetic to those issues, and you get the medical marijuana. And after, say, half a dozen years, people see, well, it hasn't really, been a problem, then they feel more comfortable with marijuana, and they begin to think, well, legalizing might be okay, especially when the Main Street Republicans start coming out and saying, hey, it's good tax revenue, it's good for commerce, we can make a lot of money with it, this is, a state's issue, this is also, a way for small businesses and entrepreneurs to flourish, it's a new kind of thing. And so people grow more comfortable with that, and these conservative states that you wouldn't normally think would have marijuana laws start to bring them in.
Right, and I've noticed that sometimes that conservatives can actually be divided on this issue. I've noticed personally by age. There are younger conservatives who are more libertarian leaning on issues like this, and they believe that either marijuana should be legalized, or at the very least, states should be able to decide this issue within their own borders. I've known some older conservatives who believe that the federal government should essentially shut down state marijuana programs because they claim under federal law it's illegal, and the federal government should absolutely enforce that. I'm personally, if you want to know my opinion, I'm the belief that states should be able to decide this issue without any interference of the federal government. I don't think the founders would have understood the Commerce Clause to allow the federal government to essentially trump state sovereignty on marijuana.
Well, as you say, conservative justices are often suspicious of that Commerce Clause that seems to be used on basically every issue, from home gardening to whatever, whether you can have a pharmacy downtown. They use the Commerce Clause on everything, and people are pretty cynical about that, especially conservative justices, and seeing that it's just a Trojan horse to get whatever you want. I think part of the Commerce Clause was also used toward the Obama's defending of the regulations for Obamacare, and rightly so. The
comments actually under that.
Right, rightly so. The states should have more influence on what they can and cannot do. If Texas wants to be an open carry state, or Wyoming wants to be an open carry state, the large rural areas that people walk around with their handguns. I'm not a big handgun fan myself, but if these states want to control their own handgun usage, then I think they should. But on the other hand, when medical marijuana or some other libertarian device comes in, you should, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We should be able to say, okay, we have an open carry state in Wyoming. Well, let's put a ballot initiative up for marijuana as well.
Mm-hmm. And I'd actually like to point out that from what I gathered, Ballotopedia, which I got much of this information off of, has not officially listed ballot issues and the measures in Arizona, Nebraska, and Montana as qualifying for the ballot as of yet. But I did research them, and apparently they have submitted the signatures, and apparently they're well above the minimum. So, it's in all likelihood those measures will qualify. The measure in Nebraska would legalize medicinal marijuana. The measures in Montana, Arizona, and New Jersey would legalize recreational marijuana. And a couple of them are actually interesting because New Jersey, there was a whole debate about this, and it sort of failed in the legislature because they couldn't agree on the particulars. And in fact, a number of municipalities have already said, we're not going to allow sales within our city borders. And the Arizona one is interesting because in 2016, they voted on this and it narrowly failed. And it actually failed largely because of socially conservative voters in the Navajo region of Arizona. They were the big force that said, we don't want this. And I found that's sort of interesting. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that South Dakota is actually voting on both medicinal marijuana and recreational marijuana. And there hasn't yet been an instance of a state without medicinal marijuana legalizing recreational marijuana, but it'll be interesting to see whether there's a split on those ballot issues.
Well, it also brings up the thread with the opposition is, once you say, well, the states have more control than the federal government, and which I agree with, then you start to say local communities and constituencies should have some control over what the states have to say. And I found that in Massachusetts, where I grew up and I visit frequently, is that local communities don't want these marijuana shops. So there are very few of them. There's some, you got to drive on average 25 miles to get to a marijuana shop. And, so local communities kind of shut these things down a little bit too. They don't want them in their town. And they should be able to have some say about that.
Right. And finally, I just wanted to take a look at an issue in Oregon that is going to be voted on, which is the legalization of magic mushrooms, which some of my friends have pointed out might be the next marijuana. So it's interesting.
Where Oregon goes, so goes the country. Is that what it is? If we're hugging trees now, then we have marijuana, and next stop is mushrooms. Well, I don't know about the therapeutic value of magic mushrooms. I'm not a doctor, but they're trying to make a case for it. And like I mentioned to you earlier, as soon as a market for it is there will be mushroom therapists everywhere on every street corner. Just come in and I'll give you some therapy for all your needs. I don't understand I don't know if it's going to pass. Oregon is a very liberal state. Does that mean that they're going to go so far as to pass a psilocybin legislation? I don't know. We'll see. But when you start to see these things creeping up like you do 20 years ago with marijuana, and you say that'll never happen, and look where we are now. So if it is mushrooms and they're starting to get a sniff of legalization, it sounds like this is the next thing down the pike.
People were saying the same thing about gay marriage a couple decades ago.
Right.
And look where we are now. I just would like to say sort of in closing thoughts, if people need to be treated for something, I would much rather that they be smoking marijuana than injecting themselves with heroin. And that's certainly in terms of the harmfulness of drugs, I certainly think that marijuana is a better alternative to opioids, especially with the whole opioid crisis going on.
Well, I think the federal government should just get out of the marijuana business. I think they should remove the criminalization of marijuana at the federal level, and that will at least allow states to control their own marijuana use or criminalization. And if we decriminalized it at the federal level, then it could be decriminalized at the state level. From what I hear, most people who are in simple possession of marijuana, they don't really get charged anymore. They don't go to jail. However, if you're in possession of a handgun while you have marijuana, then they often prosecute you and you end up going to jail for marijuana possession, because it's easier to prove possession of marijuana than it is to prove possession of an illegal handgun. So you do tend to see a lot of these people when these arguments come up about people in prison for simple marijuana use. It's a little bit more complicated than that. These people have probably had a charge dropped on an illegal handgun or distribution of marijuana or things like that. So that's something to consider too. As far as I think the states should be able to say, it's decriminalized after 21, and that we're going to make sure the kids don't get a hold of it. If you want to ban it outright, you can ban it, but get the federal government out of it.
Right. And I'd say a number of states to watch after 2020, assuming that all of these measures pass. I imagine some of them might fail, but New Mexico and New York, I think, have both, heavily litigated this issue, and the coronavirus has sort of torpedoed a lot of these measures that are taking place, not just on marijuana, but on a lot of other issues. So it'll be really interesting, to see where these issues go on after 2020, and presumably, hopefully, things will be better in terms of pandemic, like we're not in the middle of a pandemic. And but Joe, thank you for
A quick thing to add, if we want to get into the wonky weeds about it, is the fact that we're starting to see these ballot initiatives take over state legislature control, and legislators don't like to see that. They don't like to see people deciding things and taking away power from them. So there's a push-pull there. Do we have a pure democracy where people decide what they want, like Medicaid expansion? Or do we have state legislatures still control things like the gerrymandering of districts, medical marijuana, et cetera?
And I think there would actually be a difference in sort of how the founding fathers versus sort of the thought people in the 1900s, early 1900s would have thought. I think the progressive movement of the 1900s actually favored ballot initiatives. I'm wondering if maybe the founding fathers would have said, the legislatures are sovereign, they represent the people, they should be the ones who decide things. But I just want to, I know we could keep going on this. I want to talk about a lot of people have brought up the idea that, if you're going to legalize marijuana, then people who have been convicted of low-level offenses, the things that you're decriminalizing, they should have their records destroyed, because, it's not fair to legalize something and then to say the people who have been convicted of what you're legalizing are going to still be in jail. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it was a criminal charge at the time, and now if we're going to legalize it, I have some sympathy toward those people, I suppose. Like I said before, the problem is that the marijuana charges are often just used as a way to get criminals into prison, and unfortunately, if you just only have a marijuana charge on them, they do seem to have a leg to stand on when it comes to dismissing those charges, getting out of prison, etc. I have to look at it a little bit harder. I guess I don't have an opinion on it just yet.
Right. So anyway, I think this is going to wrap things up. I'm really glad we took a look at the issue of marijuana, and I really hope that we can go in depth on other issues that are being voted on this year. There's plenty that is being voted on, and plenty that might be voted on. So I really hope that we can have you back, and we can talk more about this. Joe, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot.